when you talk to farmers, and you will always hear from farmers that their families back, their parents or their grandparents, were in a much better better position from a livelihood perspective than they are. And you hear this everywhere, across the whole coffee growing world, and even you hear people talking about how in their grandparents' time, their grandparents were seen as, actually almost wealthy people in their community. And now they are some of the poorest people in their community. So for sure, something has changed here.
If you're looking for a free way to support the work we do, bringing you conversations with our amazing guests on the Daily Coffee Pro podcast by Map It Forward, please subscribe, follow, and rate us wherever you listen to the podcast. It really helps us out. It's also a huge help if you share this episode and our social media content with your coffee friends. For links, check the show notes. Welcome to the Daily Coffee Pro by Map It Forward, friends. I'm your host, Lee Safar, and this is episode 2 of a 5-part series with Paul Stewart, the Global Coffee Director of TechnoServe. And in this series, we're talking about poverty among coffee farmers, a really, really important subject as we hit 2025, which is clearly a very volatile year in the coffee industry. And the majority of farmers in the world are smallholder farmers. Paul, could you help us define what a smallholder farmer is, please?
Sure. So actually, there are multiple definitions.
Amazing. Of course there
are. Depends who you ask, but the defining thing is really how much land you have. So some people will say, it's less than 20 hectares. 20 hectares, that's a lot of land. I think, we would subscribe with a much lower number. So basically anyone with less than 5 hectares, we consider a smallholder farmer. But actually many parts of the world that would still be considered very large. Majority of smallholder farmers, coffee farmers, have a hectare or less. So that's okay. How you define it.
Okay. And then if we look at, here's a question that kept rolling around in my head while I was preparing for this series is it possible for people who have such small land and small with regards to a commercial farm, right? As we were talking in a preliminary conversation, we were talking about income versus the price of coffee. And I keep wondering, is it possible for a farm that's so small to sustain all the people that work in that ecosystem? So as we ask this question, why are smallholder coffee farmers poorer today than they were 50 years ago, I do want to ask this question. Is it possible to sustain a family or all the workers on a farm and the family on a small coffee farm?
It's a great question, and I think we'll get into the nitty-gritty details of defining that. But I think the overarching answer is it depends where you are. I think in some parts of the world, even if you have a hectare of land or less, it is possible to earn enough to look after your kids, send your kids to a decent school. In other parts of the world, that's not possible because costs are so high and other challenges. So it does depend where you live.
Okay. So if we do ask this question, why are smallholder coffee farmers poorer today than they were 50 years ago? Where do we need to start exploring that question?
Great. So first of all, I think we need to start with just understanding how big the problem is before we really get into, why is this such a problem? So there are about 12.5 million coffee farms in the world. And as you said, the majority are smallholder farms. It's actually about 99% are smallholder farms. Mm-hmm. And out of those 12.5 million family farms, around 5.5 million live below the poverty line. Now, there are different definitions of poverty. This is kind of the most, one of the most extreme levels of poverty. This means that, these are families where they're earning less than $1.90 per day. So they are struggling to survive. Now, these numbers were put together by Inveritus back in 2019, so might have moved a little bit, but I think it really helps us just to understand approximately how many really poor farmers there are out there. So there are about 5.5 million coffee farmers living in poverty. In terms of where they are, about 4 million are in Eastern Africa. 1 million are in Asia, primarily Indonesia. And that leaves about 500,000 in Latin America. So that just helps us define where they are and kind of the scale of the problem. And it'll also explain why, as we go through, the discussion, I'll talk a lot about East Africa a bit more than the other regions. And that's not just because I know Eastern Africa best, but it's where the majority of farmers living in poverty are based. And then I think in terms of, structuring the discussion of really understanding why are farmers poorer today than they were 50 years ago, I think the best way to do that is to think about, the components of profitability. Okay. So components of profitability obviously are the price times the volume minus the costs. Okay. And in the case of a coffee farmer, volume is a function of your yield, how much coffee you're producing in an area or per tree, times the size of your farmland. So that gives us 4 different components of profitability. So I won't ask you to repeat them back to me, please. So I can do it. There's price, cost, yield, and land size. So if we go through each of those, and to think about, how is that component different today to it was 50 years ago? We can see where the changes have occurred that have resulted in farmers being poor today. And actually, I should actually say before we jump into it, when you talk to farmers, and you will always hear from farmers that their families back, their parents or their grandparents, were in a much better position from a livelihood perspective than they are. And you hear this everywhere, across the whole coffee growing world, and even you hear people talking about how in their grandparents' time, their grandparents were seen as, actually almost wealthy people in their community. And now they are some of the poorest people in their community. So for sure, something has changed here. And also, actually, I remember when I started working in Tanzania over 20 years ago, every senior government official I remember meeting would always tell me, in the middle of the conversation, they would kind of stop me and say, by the way, we're talking about coffee. I am here today because of coffee, because my parents had a coffee farm. Often it was on Mount Kilimanjaro. And they say, coffee paid for my education at the best school in the country. And yeah, I'm where I am today. And I heard that over and over again. And I don't think it's just the case in Tanzania. There are many people who are in, senior positions like that because of, the income from coffee and from their parents and their grandparents' time. So for sure, something has changed. So let's go through each of those 4 components of profitability, and let's see where things have changed. So the first is, let's go with price. Everybody wants to hear about price first. That must be the biggest issue. So fortunately, I actually was shared the ICO, International Coffee Organization. They have an economist who shared with me a chart that he had created showing inflation-adjusted prices. And it's, a fascinating chart. So obviously today, $4 per pound of kind of the international benchmark price. And if we go back, inflation adjusted, the chart really looks very different to if you just use absolute numbers. It peaks in, I think it was 1977 at over $16. And that was a time when there was huge frost issues in Brazil that decimated the crop, and there were global shortages of coffee. But if we just go a little bit beyond that to 50 years ago, that was kind of the early 1970s, late 1960s. Actually, the price was relatively stable. And when we look at inflation adjusted, it was around $4 a pound. Mm-hmm. So now, interestingly, that's where we were a couple of months ago. Mm-hmm. But I don't think it would be fair to say, oh, the price is the same today as it was, 50 years ago. Reality is, a year ago, last couple of years, price has been more around $2. If we go many years, 5 years ago, the price was around $1. And so let's just say, take, the average price of around $2 over the last couple of years. And that's, we can just make that estimate and say, well, coffee prices are around half now than they were 50 years ago.
Mm-hmm. That's fair.
Just for simplicity. Okay, so that was price. So let's go to cost. Okay, cost is a little bit of a tricky one because it really depends on the country. So East Africa, as I said, majority of the world's poorest farmers live in East Africa. Their costs are minimal. They don't hire labor much, maybe a little bit to help with harvesting. Because their farms are so small, they're able to do the majority of the work just themselves. And so their costs are very low. So in reality, their costs haven't really changed much in the last 50 years ago. Now, if you look at other countries like Costa Rica and even places like Puerto Rico, which have, all but almost disappeared as coffee producing countries, reason for that is because the cost of labor has just gone up and up and up and up. And that's driven obviously by the wider economy growing, which is generating a lot of jobs, which results in labor costs going up. And that's great for those communities because it means there are other opportunities. And in many of those places, coffee no longer becomes that interesting. But if we look at, the other area, places like in parts of Latin America, for sure, and it depends a bit on the country, but places like Guatemala, Nicaragua, labor costs have certainly increased a bit. So costs have definitely gone up for some farmers and not gone up for other farmers. So let's just call that even just for simplicity.
Can I ask a question there? What about the cost of inputs?
Good point. So I actually found an interesting chart recently on the inflation-adjusted fertilizer.
I love an interesting chart.
Going back 50 years. I couldn't believe it when I found this because it was a question I had in my own mind. And interestingly, price of fertilizer 50 years ago to today, it's around the same level. However, it's incredibly volatile.
Yeah.
And that is because fertilizer tends to, follow energy prices. So when oil prices go up, fertilizer prices go up as well. And there have been periods, even recent in 2022, fertilizer prices went
Russia,
really high.
Ukraine.
2008, exactly, because of lack of supply. 2008, there was, another shock in the fertilizer market. So while kind of over kind of the average across 50 years, there have definitely been times when fertilizer is even cheaper than it is today. But it's really gone up and down. So I kind of leave that one.
Okay, great. Thanks for helping me understand that, because everybody's talking about how the cost of inputs are super high right now. And the truth of the matter is a lot of the fertilizer companies are, because of the price volatility right now, and it went up, they are putting their prices up.
Yes. Yeah. No, and I think it is certainly probably at a higher level now than, we've certainly seen in, other times. So, look, we are higher, and certainly, in some areas, parts of the world, that's definitely true. But it's not like a doubling or a tripling something. It's maybe just, let's say, 50% higher or something. But number three, okay, yield. Okay, so yield, maybe it's important just to explain. So the normal way of expressing yield is kilograms of green coffee per hectare. Now, we also sometimes look at kilograms of cherry coffee per tree. Depends where you are and what you're using it for. But let's stick with kilograms of green coffee per hectare. So if we look at yield of smallholder farmers over the last 50 years, it hasn't changed much. And that's a big issue. Yeah. Yep. It's maybe in some parts of Central America, it has gone up a little bit, but you're talking maybe 10, 20%. But in most parts of the world, it really, for smallholders, it has not changed.
I would have thought it went down. Given what's happening with the weather, right?
Yeah.
Go on.
Yeah, look, we don't have great data on this. Okay. We don't have good data sets from 50 years ago, but, trying to estimate numbers of farmers and trees and all the rest, it probably hasn't changed that much. I think you're right to point out that, weather issues definitely means some years it's maybe even less than that, and disease shocks. There's definitely been,
100%.
Issues. You look at Latin America and parts of Central America, a few years ago when there was, and the leaf rust and, problem for sure, yields were a bit lower during those, or a lot lower. Many farmers totally lost their crops. But kind of, holding that constant, not to sound like an economist, your economists will all be saying that many times, but, kind of just not factoring in those big weather shocks. And we can definitely talk about that later in terms of how that's going to affect farmers more in the future, I think. But I would say, just for simplicity, it hasn't really, yields haven't changed that much.
Okay. And then number 4?
Number 4, the last one, and I kept the most interesting
to last.
Yeah, so land size. So this is really, really an interesting, challenge for farmers. Due to population growth and lack of other economic opportunities, we see, land size reducing over time in most smallholder coffee growing communities. So to illustrate, in some places, Uganda, there happens to be some good data available. In Uganda, a few years ago when it was measured, average smallholder farm, this is not just coffee, but their entire farms, was about 1 hectare. 25 years previous, it was 2 hectares. 25 years before that, it was 4 hectares.
Wow.
So, and it's interesting, like I find when I talk to farmers and I ask, I got into the habit of asking farmers this question of, how big is your farm today? How big was your parents' farm? And how big was your grandparents' farm? And in Eastern Africa, in most areas, you have exactly the same trend. Their parents' farm was double the size of their farm, and their grandparents' farm was double that again. So they're farming on a quarter of the land that their grandparents were farming on. Now, it's interesting, as part of some research we did in Central America, particularly looking at the impacts and effects of migration, we ran a survey where we asked over 1,000 farmers that simple question: how big is your land today? How big was it? Was your parents' farm, and how big was your grandparents? And in I think 2 or 3 of the countries, it was exactly a third. So not quite as bad as East Africa. In El Salvador, farmers today, average size 2.5 hectares. Their grandparents, 7.5 hectares.
Wow.
Nicaragua today, it's interesting, Nicaragua has much larger farms, and today it's about 8 hectares. We heard from the farmers, and their grandparents had 26 hectares. Now, to be clear, there are some exceptions to that, like Honduras and Peru. I think, areas where coffee farming has really grown a lot, in more recent years, and, and farmers have been expanding into new areas of land. But those are really the exceptions where we've seen farm sizes increasing. So if you take that, combined effect of, prices have halved, land size is now either a third or a quarter what it was, and even costs, as we said, in many places are much higher. Then, we're looking at maybe farmers earning 1/8 or 1/10 of what they were earning, inflation adjusted 50 years ago. And the impact of that, obviously, is that so many smallholder farmers, they do not have enough to live. Like in Ethiopia, a farmer in Sidamo, a couple of years ago when prices were lower, they were only earning $400 a year from their coffee. And maybe they were earning $400 from other things that they were growing and selling. So earning about $800. And with coffee prices having gone up in the last couple of years, the coffee income's gone up, but because their yields are still so low, it doesn't have that big an impact. So now they're maybe making $600 from their coffee. So that brings their total income to about $1,000, which is, maybe it might be above the poverty line in some cases for a lot of those farmers, but barely, that's not a level where you can provide a decent, living for your families.
Yeah, wow. In the next episode, we're going to talk about why this is such a hard problem to solve, because it begs the question, what incentive do we have for coffee producers to continue producing coffee if this is such a hard problem to solve? So join us for the next episode, folks. Peace, love, and peanut butter. Have an amazing rest of your day. I really hope you enjoyed this episode, friends. Please don't forget to show us some love by subscribing, liking, commenting, and most of all, sharing this podcast with your friends. Check the show notes for links, including our sponsors and our Patreon. And stay tuned for more great conversations on the Daily Coffee Pro by Map It Forward.